1918 arrived without much fanfare, and the fifth year of the Great War was officially underway. As with the previous winters, the Western Front ground to a frozen standstill, as soldiers on both sides lay covered in their holes and trenches shivering. 1917 had been a year dominated by Allied offensives. The British drives at Arras and Cambrai had produced modest gains, but nothing of a decisive nature. While some land originally lost to the Germans in 1914 had been recaptured, the German army had taken advantage of their own retreats to consolidate their lines. They now lay dug in along what was called the Hindenburg Line, a fortified system of trenches and bulwarks designed to exploit any defensive advantages offered by the lay of the terrain. 4 years of brutal warfare had left both the Allied and German powers at the end of their endurance. In England, labor disputes threatened time and time again to halt production of various war materials and equipment, and food shortages inside Germany had left its people despondent and on the brink of revolution. In Russia, there had been a revolution, and most of their soldiers had simply laid down their arms, turned around and begun walking home, having had quite enough of their Tsar's war. The German High Command realized that their situation would quickly become desperate. Although they sat firmly entrenched in the West, the previous 4 years of attrition, coupled with the strangling effects of the Allied naval blockade, had left the fatherland on her last reserves. The first American soldiers had appeared in battle that previous autumn, and were now arriving in greater numbers every day. With troops newly freed from the fighting on the Eastern Front, the German High Commander, Field Marshal Erich Ludendorff, prepared to hurl his 35 divisions towards Paris in a last-ditch effort to bring about final victory. The Great Springtime Offensive would be the most ambitious German effort since the beginning of the war, but Ludendorff was convinced that any chances of victory would be lost once the American army was firmly established in France. In February, Roland Garros, the world's first fighter pilot and the original ace, escaped from the German prison where he'd been languishing ever since his capture 2.5 years earlier. A series of daring adventures had taken him from imprisonment at the citadel of Magdeburg, across the frontier into neutral Holland, and then finally on to England. Garros was eager to get back to the fighting, but for the time being would have to start over again. The Frenchman was sent to the big flying school at Pau to begin retraining for the air war he'd been so instrumental in pioneering. It must have amazed him how sophisticated the business had become, ever since the days when he'd mounted steel wedges on the blades of his Moraine's propeller so he could have a go at the German machines he was encountering. On March 21st, the German springtime offensive began when 6,000 heavy guns unleashed a pulverizing barrage at 3 points along the British lines. When the barrage came to an end and the Kaiser's troops began their advance across the British positions, their gains were rapid. It wouldn't take long before the Germans had recaptured most of the ground lost to the Allied offensives of the previous year. Manfred von Richthofen was back at the front with Jagdgeschwader 1 by the beginning of March to prepare for the coming battle. The Baron had been out of the fighting since the end of November, after he'd scored his 63rd victory over one of the SE-5As belonging to RFC No. 41 Squadron. By mid-January, von Richthofen, along with many of Germany's top-rated flyers, had gathered at Adlershof Airfield outside of Berlin to take part in the evaluation trials of new machines. The 5 leading aircraft firms had submitted 28 new types to be tested by the men who would eventually fly them in battle. Among one of the more promising designs being tested was a new biplane submitted by the Fokker firm. When the Adlershof trials came to an end, von Richthofen traveled on to his family home at Schweidnitz. From the earliest days of his rise to become Germany's greatest flyer, Manfred had carefully boxed up and sent home the numerous mementos and trophies of his career. Sitting with his mother and looking through the photographs spanning his time at the front, it depressed him to realize how many of his comrades had fallen in combat. When the day came for the Baron to return to duty, he was driven by his sister Ilse to the train station to begin his journey back to Berlin. Although he would have no way of knowing it, this would be his last trip home. Back with his flying circus, preparations began for the coming push. Although most of JG-1's pilots had been re-equipped with Fokker triplanes, structural problems still persisted. Kurt Wolff had narrowly escaped death when his upper wing had collapsed a few miles south of his home airfield. Although Wolff had skillfully brought the machine back to Earth, the event had shaken him and only increased the distrust him and his fellow pilots felt for the triplane. For now, the Jasta pilots would have to make do. It would be at least 2 months before the newer designs began appearing. The Allied squadrons were by now enjoying the benefit offered by the increased output of their nation's newest designs. The English SE-5As and Sopwith Camos were in widespread use up and down the front, while France's Spad-13, a remarkable continuation of the sturdy Spad-7 design, was appearing in greater numbers with the Escadrilles de Chasse. Bristol's 2-seat fighter, the F-2B, had also proven its worth over the battlefields of France. After the airplane's disastrous introduction to combat during Bloody April the previous spring, the Brisfit pilots had changed their tactics and had become a force to be reckoned with. Instead of flying the machine like a 2-seater, the pilots had quickly learned to treat the Brisfits like a scout by aggressively going after the enemy with their front gun, while the observer protected the tail with his Lewis. Andrew McKeever, from Ontario, Canada, had the good fortune to arrive at No. 11 Squadron shortly after the unit made the switch to Bristol's. Along with his observer, Lieutenant L.F. Powell, he began a remarkable string of victories that would earn him a spot on Britain's list of top aces, with 30 confirmed kills before the end of hostilities. Powell would also be credited with a half-dozen victories, making him one of the few backseaters of the war to achieve ace status. March began well enough for the Red Baron's younger brother. On the 11th, Lothar scored his 27th kill over one of the Brisfits belonging to No. 48 Squadron, and the following day knocked down 2 more machines of the same type during a running battle that lasted for 10 minutes near Cambrai. A day later, the younger von Richthofen found himself once again in battle against Bristol fighters, this time joined by Sopwith Camels being flown by pilots of No. 73 Squadron. In the ensuing battle, Lothar's top wing collapsed and his Fokker dropped from 4,000 meters to a controlled crash that left him badly bruised and with a broken jaw. This latest injury would keep him out of combat for 4 months. Manfred had taken part in the same battle, with one of the Sopwiths falling to his guns to become his 65th victory. The Camel's pilot, another Canadian named Elmer Ernest Heath, came down on the German side of the line badly wounded but alive, and would go on to carry 2 of the Baron's bullets lodged inside his body until his peaceful death in 1965. Although it had taken America considerable time to get into the action since her declaration of war, the first few months of the new year had witnessed a flood of men and materials arriving at the docks of England and France. The fresh troops of the American Expeditionary Forces, eager to deliver the final blow to the haggard German army, poured off their ships and under the command of General Blackjack Pershing were moved into position along the front. Manpower was the one thing the United States offered vast quantities of, and before it was all finished, nearly 2 million Americans would have sailed to Europe to join the fight. The United States' wartime industrial output, however, fell woefully short of her boasts of the previous year. Where 23,000 tanks had been ordered from American factories, scarcely 24 had been completed by the war's end. Likewise, only 130 artillery pieces of the 2,000 used by the American forces had been produced in the United States. The lack of American-built airplanes was to be a source of great embarrassment to the politicians at home, who boasted that 20,000 American-built machines would darken the skies over Europe. In truth, not a single American-designed airplane was to see service in France. Operating under license from the British de Havilland Company, American firms did, however, turn out a number of DH-4 bombers powered by Detroit's Liberty engine. There was no shortage of Americans volunteering for service in aviation. By October of 1917, some 7,000 cadets had entered ground schools in the States, and 500 of them had actually completed flight training. Unfortunately, any flight training the cadets received were on antique types, including the slow-moving Curtiss Jenny, and the new flyers were considered far from qualified to join in the Great Air War. Upon their arrival in France, they would have to be further trained to fly the modern airplanes the American Air Service was beginning to procure from the French. A large training school was set up at Issoudun for the purpose of introducing the incoming American flyers to the various French machines. Whereas Issoudun had originally been conceived as an advanced training school only, it was soon expanded to include primary training and would eventually cover 50 square miles of land and comprise a dozen separate airfields. Ever since America's entry into the war, it had been assumed that the volunteers who'd been serving in the air forces of Britain and France would be absorbed into the new U.S. Air Service. The Lafayette Flying Corps, its ranks by now swelled to hundreds of members, would offer a pool of experienced combat veterans for the American service to draw upon. In January, the transfer began, and both the Lafayette Escadrille and the Lafayette Flying Corps ceased to be. Raoul Lufberry, the most celebrated of the Lafayette Flyers, with 17 victories, was commissioned a major in the United States Air Service and informed that he would be given one of the new American squadrons. Unfortunately, as Lufberry learned, the squadron existed on paper only, and in the meantime he was sent to Issoudun, where he found himself anchored to a desk and buried under a mountain of paperwork. Among the first American flyers to make it to the front was Edward V. Rickenbacker, a man of remarkable resourcefulness who would go on to become America's ace of aces. Born in 1890 in Columbus, Ohio, the third of 8 children, Eddie Rickenbacker grew up in the American heartland at a time when the miracle of modern invention seemed to offer limitless opportunities for an industrious young man. When his father was killed in an accident, Eddie, all of 13 years old, left school for good and began working in a glass foundry. Working 6 12-hour shifts each week contributed $3.50 to the family fund. Rickenbacker's climb up the ladder next found him working for the Buckeye Steel Casting Company, now 14 years old and earning the princely sum of $1 each day. Next followed a job carving cemetery monuments that paid 50 cents more per day. After 3 months of breathing stone dust, Eddie took a job working in a machine shop for the Pennsylvania Railroad. It was here that the teen discovered his love for machines, and before long had secured a position in a garage, servicing a recent invention called the automobile. The mechanic's job was a slight step backwards in pay, but young Eddie quickly became expert in the care of these new machines, and was soon working for the Freyer Miller Company, a firm that was engaged in building racing automobiles. Before long, Rickenbacker basically knew all there was to know about gasoline-powered automobiles, and eventually became involved in their design. Next came a mechanic's job with the Duesenberg racing team, and finally as a race driver himself for that company. Over the next several years, Eddie Rickenbacker was to make a name for himself as one of the Duesenberg drivers, racing on all the famous tracks around the country, including the Indianapolis Speedway, and winning his share of races. At the end of 1916, Rickenbacker sailed to England as a representative of the Sunbeam Motor Company, with the intention of developing an English racing team. In England, the Germanic nature of his family name was cause for concern with the British authorities, and he found himself constantly followed by British agents throughout his stay. Eddie Rickenbacker was no spy, though, and on this first trip abroad, he was to become enamored to the British cause. Immediately upon his return to the United States, he began preaching what he called the 3 M's for the Allied war effort: money, munitions, and men. A year later, Rickenbacker again sailed for Europe, this time landing in France, where he was commissioned a sergeant in the American Expeditionary Force and given the job of chauffeuring staff officers around. His ability to repair motors in the field landed him the job as Colonel William Billy Mitchell's personal driver, and it was here that Eddie Rickenbacker became acquainted with the fledgling American Air Service. Colonel Mitchell, the great American military air pioneer, eventually secured Rickenbacker's transfer to the big flying school at Issoudun. At the age of 28, Rickenbacker was considerably older than his classmates, but his success at auto racing had demonstrated that he possessed fast reflexes and a keen eye. The first 2 American units to become operational were the 94th and 95th Pursuit Aero Squadrons, which set up shop at Villenoy in early March as part of the U.S. 1st Pursuit Group. Raoul Lufberry had managed to get himself attached to the 94th, but not as the squadron leader, which suited him fine, as his time at Issoudun had made it painfully clear how much he disliked the extra paperwork that accompanied the job. Instead, the squadron was to be commanded by Major John Huffer, a French-born American who'd been serving in French squadrons on the Italian front. Besides Lufberry, other Lafayette alumni who found themselves assigned to the 94th included James Norman Hall, Bill Loomis of Bedford, Massachusetts, and Alan Winslow, a native of Forest Park, Illinois. Eddie Rickenbacker, fresh from the flying school, also reported to the 94th towards the end of March. For aircraft, the 2 new American squadrons had been given Newport 28s, a fairly modern design, but considered a cast-off by the French units, who'd preferred the newer Spad 13s. The Newport was a plane with good performance characteristics, being fast and nimble, but suffered the unsavory habit of shedding its wing covering in a long dive. France had allotted nearly 300 of these fighters to the U.S. Air Service, and although the first units were deemed operational by mid-March, it wouldn't be for several weeks until the machine guns arrived to arm the airplanes. For the time being, the American squadrons went aloft and familiarized themselves with the area while they awaited their guns. For a squadron emblem, Major Huffer suggested a hat and a ring, a traditional challenge to a fight, and the 94th was henceforth known as Uncle Sam's Hat in the Ring Squadron. By the middle of April, the squadron was fully operational, and on the 14th, Douglas Campbell had the honor of scoring the first American victory of the war. Campbell, a native of San Francisco, had abandoned his studies at Harvard upon America's declaration of war, and had been one of the first cadets to enroll in the expanding air service. Within minutes of Campbell's first victory, a second German plane fell to American guns, this time to the victorious Alan Winslow. American journalists descended on the airfield at Villenoy to report on the accomplishment, and the exploits of their nation's double kill was splashed across headline banners of every major American newspaper. The United States had finally entered the arena of the Great War in the air. Germany's great springtime offensive had been planned as a series of pushes, each with its own set of strategic objectives. On April 4th, the second phase began, with 15 divisions overrunning the town of Hamel and capturing its important heights. This was to be a prelude to their immediate goal of a drive on Amiens through the region just north of the Somme, an area defended by British and Australian troops. On April 1st, the British had absorbed their Royal Flying Corps and Royal Naval Air Service into a new branch called the Royal Air Force. The new service placed all the flying units on the Western Front under one central command, and its leaders, determined to avoid the slaughter of the previous April, were exploiting the advantages offered by better airplanes flying in larger formations. The pilots of Jagdgeschwader 1, thrust into the thick of fighting around the Somme region, found themselves for the first time fighting at a disadvantage. While the Fokker triplane had demonstrated remarkable maneuverability, it was outclassed by both the SE-5As and the Sopwith Camels that the British were using in greater and greater numbers. The delivery of Anthony Fokker's newest biplane fighter was being awaited with great anticipation, but as of yet, none had arrived at the front. In early April, von Richthofen and JG-1 took up their newest residence at Kappy Airfield, located just 10 minutes behind the front lines. Von Richthofen was still leading his circus over the front on an almost daily basis, but the fierceness of the battle, coupled with his increased administrative duties, were beginning to take its toll. His wounding during the previous July had come back to haunt him in the form of severe headaches, and he grew increasingly irritable and outwardly grim. The first week of April added 4 British machines to his victory score, including a pair of Sopwith Camels that he forced down on the 7th. Manfred von Richthofen's tally now stood at 78 kills. Just as Oswald Bolka had striven to find and cultivate the most promising talent for his squadron, von Richthofen continued the tradition and had no qualms about pirating the best up-and-coming flyers from other units. In March, he had invited Ernst Udet to join his elite unit. Remembered as one of the most charismatic young men serving in the German air service, Udet had been born in 1896 at Frankfurt am Main, the son of a wealthy landowner. When war began, Udet, then 17, had managed to enlist in the army, where he served as a motorcycle messenger in Belgium until a road accident landed him in the hospital for 10 days. During the brief leave that accompanied his discharge from the hospital, he applied for transfer to aviation, and after earning his pilot certificate, spent the next year chauffeuring two-seaters over the front. Udet's tenacity in two-seat machines earned him an Iron Cross First Class and an advancement to Jasta 37, flying Albatross Scouts. By March 23rd, when von Richthofen invited Ernst Udet to join JG-1, the not yet 22-year-old pilot was one of the fatherland's most promising aces, with 20 confirmed victories and the Pour le Mérite hanging from his neck. The next day, Udet was given command of Jasta 4, where he immediately began to mount an impressive score of victories that would eventually rank him second on the list of German aces. On April 20th, von Richthofen was leading an early evening patrol comprised of 6 Fokkers when he ran into a large formation of Sopwith Camels belonging to RAF Squadron No. 3. Within 3 minutes, Manfred had downed 2 of the enemy machines. The first kill, the Baron's 79th victory, was scored over the 24-year-old Major Richard Raymond Barker, whose Camel fell in flames, incinerating its pilot so completely that Raymond Barker's body was never recovered. The second Camel to fall to von Richthofen's guns during that fight also caught fire, but its pilot, Second Lieutenant David G. Lewis, somehow managed to survive the subsequent crash, which occurred not 50 meters from the burning wreckage of Raymond Barker's machine. As Lewis stood between the 2 burning wrecks, von Richthofen flew past the British pilot and waved. Neither man could have known that David Lewis would be Manfred von Richthofen's last victory. April 21st dawned with Kappy Airfield blanketed under thick fog. As the pilots of Jasta 11 waited for the fog to lift, von Richthofen was in high spirits. The previous evening's celebration of his 79th and 80th victories had carried well into the night, and he now stood joking with his men and playing with Moritz, his Great Dane. It had been suggested that von Richthofen would retire from combat upon achieving his 80th kill, but he himself had nixed the idea, stating that 100 victories would be a far better number to cap his career and retire him from active flying. By 10:30 a.m., the fog had lifted enough to allow the squadron to take to the air, and with the Baron at the lead, the Fokker triplanes of Jasta 11 climbed away from Kappy and headed towards the front. April 21st would be a busy day along the Western Front, and by the time von Richthofen took to the air, British machines were already engaged in their work, taking reconnaissance photos and directing the artillery fire for their batteries on the ground. At the same time the Jasta 11 pilots were climbing into the air, a squadron of Sopwith Camels was taking off from its base at Bertangles, 20 miles away. Until recently, this squadron had been designated Royal Naval No. 9, but had since been absorbed into the new Royal Air Force as No. 209 Squadron. 209 would be flying at full strength today, performing a high offensive patrol broken into 3 sections. A flight was led by Captain Roy Brown, a native of Calleton Place, Ontario. Brown had been in action since early 1917, and by now had 11 victories under his belt. Recent months in combat, however, had left Brown both physically and mentally fatigued, and only a few days earlier he had been urged by his friend Ray Collishaw, the great Sopwith triplane ace, to add himself to the sick roll and have himself removed from duty. To Collishaw, Brown appeared on the verge of a nervous breakdown as he obsessed over the welfare of the men he was leading in battle. The newest member of 209 Squadron and A-Flight was Wilfred May, a school chum of Brown's from back in Ontario. The arrival of May had undoubtedly increased the level of Roy Brown's stress, and on the morning of the 21st he had urged the neophyte to stick close to his leader and avoid getting into any single combats with the seasoned German flyers they would probably be encountering. As von Richthofen and his flyers approached the front, they were joined by a group of albatrosses belonging to Jasta 5, and within minutes had spotted the dozen Sopwith Camels of No. 209 Squadron. The German pilots didn't have to wait for the Baron's signal to attack, and immediately found themselves twisting and zooming in a large dogfight, slowly drifting towards the British lines. Following Brown's instructions, Wilfred May hovered on the fringes of the free-for-all, until a Fokker crossed in front of his Sopwith, and May, giving in to temptation, briefly pursued it and fired off a few shots. It was then that he saw the all-red triplane that had come up behind his tail, and remembering his old chum's advice, dropped his nose and opened his throttle towards the British lines. Whether Manfred von Richthofen had become disoriented about the direction in which he was traveling, or for once had thrown caution to the wind, will never be known. But the fact remains that on this occasion, von Richthofen committed one of his rare mistakes by giving chase to the Camel. As May sped west along the Somme River Valley, weaving to and fro to avoid the Baron's guns, von Richthofen concentrated on what he was sure would be his 81st victory. Roy Brown had seen May dive away from the dogfight pursued by the red triplane and had torn after them from above. As the planes raced down the Somme, the chase was witnessed by hundreds of troops on the ground, including several groups of Australian machine gunners who fired as the Baron passed. Brown had also managed to fire at von Richthofen, and after passing Morlancourt Ridge, the triplane seemed to briefly stagger before performing a sideslip and falling in a steep glide that brought it crashing to the ground on its nose. In the cockpit, Manfred von Richthofen sat dead, a single bullet having passed through his chest. Within minutes, the crash site was swarming with British and Australian troops, many who had witnessed the dramatic last flight of the Red Baron. Of course, everybody at the front knew about the famous red triplane, and once the Baron's body was pulled from the wreckage and his papers examined, there was no doubt as to the identity of the dead flyer. Aside from the entry and exit wounds of the shot that had killed him, the only other damage to von Richthofen's body had been caused when his face had smashed against the butt of his guns upon the impact of the crash. A single bullet had entered the Baron's lower left back and exited his chest slightly higher into the right. While death must have come quickly to von Richthofen, observers on the scene noted that the Fokker's motor had been switched to the off position, suggesting that the Baron must have known he was in trouble and killed the engine in those last few seconds of his life. As the day wore on, the crash scene was visited by hundreds of soldiers who came to view the remains of the famous Red Baron in his triplane. The Fokker was quickly hacked to pieces as people collected souvenirs from the wreckage, until all that eventually remained of the machine was the metal framework. The Baron himself wasn't spared by the souvenir hunters either. Before a guard could be placed on the body, his helmet, goggles, boots, papers, and even the buttons on his clothing had disappeared. Back at Kappy Airfield, it was not immediately known what had happened to Jagdgeschwader 1's leader. While the pilots of Jasta 11 had been engaged fighting the British Sopwiths, no one had seen the Baron drop away to pursue Wilfred May. At first, there was no cause for undue alarm. It was assumed that von Richthofen had probably landed at another airfield and would soon be home. As the afternoon wore on, with no word from the Rittmeister, the squadron's adjutant, Karl Bodenschatz, got on the telephone and began making inquiries. German observers located on a hilltop across the Somme had witnessed the Baron's last flight, including what appeared to them to be a controlled landing when von Richthofen had come down. This was good news, the German pilots reasoned, harboring the hope that their leader was at least alive, albeit a prisoner of the British. 2 days later, the true facts were revealed, when an English flyer dropped a note on the German side stating that the Baron had been killed in combat and subsequently laid to rest with full military honors. A controversy over who had actually killed the Red Baron arose almost immediately. At least 3 men had submitted claims for the deed. The first claim was, of course, by Roy Brown, whose part in the chase had been witnessed by hundreds of soldiers and believed it was his shot that had brought the Baron down. 2 Australian machine gunners each believed that they had scored the fatal shot. Gunner Cedric Popkin had fired some 80 rounds at the triplane when it had passed very near his position shortly before its crash. A second gun, manned by Robert Bowie and W.J. Evans, also got off a shot as the chase had passed over their position. In addition, dozens of small arms had been fired at the red triplane during the course of events. Roy Brown received official credit from the Royal Air Force for downing the Baron, while Cedric Popkin was credited by the Australians. The trajectory of the bullet that passed through the Red Baron's body suggests that it was indeed a shot from the ground that had ended the chase, but the truth will never be known, and the controversy has continued for years. By the end of April, the first of the promised Fokker biplanes began arriving at the front. The D-7 was to be the most important design to come out of the Dutchman's factory at Schwerin. Despite any faults it might have shown, the success of the triplane design had suddenly paved the way for Fokker to procure the better inline engines being built by BMW and Mercedes. The brainchild of chief designer Reinhold Platz, the D-7 again used Platz's construction method of a steel tube framing. The pilots lucky enough to get the new fighter were delighted. Fast, nimble, and sturdy, the plane could literally hang on its propeller while climbing and drop like a stone in a full-out dive. The machines went into immediate production at both the Fokker plant and under license by the Albatross Company, and by the coming autumn, 40 Jastas would be equipped with the plane. With the Red Baron dead, command of Jagdgeschwader 1 went to William Reinhard, whom von Richthofen had named in his will as his successor. While Reinhard was an accomplished flyer and a capable leader, the stunning success that JG-1 had enjoyed for so long seemed to be grinding down. Towards the end of May, the wing was moved away from the killing fields of the Somme and relocated to the Marne region, further south, facing off against the French air service. The pace of the air war was somewhat slower on this front, and the pilots of JG-1 were given somewhat of a reprieve for the time being. In addition to the new Fokker D-7s that were trickling into the inventories of frontline units, the pilots of the Flieger Troop would shortly begin receiving parachutes for the first time. While not a new invention, it seems inconceivable that a compact version of this life-saving device had not been developed earlier for the pilots to use. Balloon observers had been equipped with parachutes since 1915, and had they been made available for aircraft crews, many lives would have no doubt been spared through the course of the war. A year earlier, the British had considered supplying its flyers with parachutes, but had passed on the idea, afraid that its pilots might be tempted to jump from a machine that might otherwise be brought home. Besides the French escadrilles the flying circus was now squared off against, they found themselves for the first time in combat with the newly formed American squadrons. It hadn't taken long for the American flyers to get into the swing of operational flying, and it was the 94th Aero, Uncle Sam's hat-in-the-ring squadron, that had quickly established itself as the United States' top-scoring unit. Eddie Rickenbacker had downed his first German airplane near the end of April, when he and Jim Hall had boxed in a Pfalz single-seater. Mature and methodical, the former auto racer had spent his first 6 weeks in combat carefully learning his new trade, analyzing each mission he flew and striving to improve on any flaws he perceived he might have made. With the scoring of his first kill, Rickenbacker was on his way, and by the end of the following month he would be an ace. James Norman Hall's wartime career ended on May 6th, when a German anti-aircraft shell slammed into the motor of his Nieuport. Although the round failed to explode, Hall's machine was knocked out of action, and after a wild ride earthwards that saw the Nieuport's wings shedding their fabric, Hall managed to get his plane onto the ground, where he was immediately taken prisoner. The continuing problem the Nieuport 28s were having with their wing covering almost killed Eddie Rickenbacker on the 17th, when he dove in hot pursuit after an Albatross fighter over Richecourt. Moments after scoring hits on the German machine, which went straight into the ground, he heard a loud crack and was horrified to see most of the fabric fluttering loose from his upper wing. The Nieuport miraculously stayed airborne, and by carefully experimenting with the combination of stick, rudder, and throttle, had somehow managed to limp home across the lines. It had been a close call for America's future ace of aces. During a discussion amongst the Hat in the Ring Squadron's pilots, the subject of catching fire had come up. Being burned to death in the air was every combat flyer's greatest nightmare, and opinions varied on the pilot's best action to take should the unthinkable occur. Some vowed that they would jump and fall to their death before allowing themselves to burn up. Raoul Lufberry was of the opinion that he would never abandon his machine if it caught fire, but would ride it down, trying to sideslip the flames away from himself. Jumping, he reasoned, meant sure death, while staying with the craft offered the pilot at least a chance of survival. On the morning of May 10th, Lufberry found himself racing into the air to intercept a German photography machine that was approaching his home base. In full view of the Americans on the ground, he was watched as he repeatedly attacked the German plane, which flew along unaffected. The newer Albatross two-seaters were by now heavily armored, which made them increasingly difficult to knock down. As his friends looked on, Lufberry's Nieuport swerved in behind the Albatross for another try, and then suddenly burst into flames. Lufberry's plane then rolled over onto its back, and the American fell away from the burning machine. It's unknown whether Raoul Lufberry had jumped to spare himself from the inferno, or had simply failed to fasten his seatbelt as he'd rushed to get airborne and intercept the German. Major Lufberry had fallen in a French village not far from the airfield, where his lifeless body lay impaled on a picket fence. Early in the spring, James McCudden had been relieved from No. 56 Squadron, promoted to the rank of Major, and sent home to England. His last month of combat flying had been a productive one. 11 German aircraft downed in 6 days of actual flying. This brought the Englishman's official tally to 57 enemy machines destroyed, and after a month's leave, the great pilot would begin a lecture and training tour of the advanced flying schools of Britain. This break from operational flying also afforded McCudden the opportunity to begin writing his memoirs. McCudden's book, eventually published as 5 Years in the Royal Flying Corps, would be a remarkable narrative told by one of the few living men who'd experienced the early development of British military aviation firsthand. On April 6th, McCudden was summoned to Buckingham Palace, where the King himself presented the flyer with the Victoria Cross, a bar to his military cross, and the Distinguished Service Order. McCudden's would be one of only 19 Victoria Cross recipients awarded to flyers in the First World War. As the spring gave way to summer, McCudden found himself growing restless and eager to return to the fighting in France. In June, he was visited by Edward Manock, himself on leave, newly promoted to Major, and about to return to combat as the new commander of No. 85 Squadron. At the time, Manock's personal score stood at 59 victories, making him the second-ranked British ace behind the Canadian Billy Bishop. For his part, McCudden had no problem securing his transfer back to France, and he was to be given command of No. 60 Squadron, Billy Bishop's old unit. On July 5th, he wrote what would be the last words of his memoirs. "I am now in England training the young idea, but my heart is in France, amongst the gallant boys who are daily dying and those who are dead, having given themselves to that most wonderful cause." James McCudden would never rejoin that most wonderful cause. 3 days after writing his last words, he'd left England with a factory-fresh SE-5A and flew across the Channel, spending the night on the ground at Eau-le-Château Airdrome. In the morning he planned to carry on to his new assignment, but immediately after taking off, his motor quit, and as McCudden banked to turn back towards the airfield, his machine suddenly lost flying speed, stalled, and spun into the ground. James McCudden, one of the Empire's greatest flyers, had been killed by making a mistake that even the most novice of pilots would have been warned against. Mick Mannock also fell in July, shortly after taking over as the acting commander of No. 85 Squadron. Mannock had been something of an enigma. Fueled by a deep hatred of the Germans, he was a man of great temper, yet in the air was the consummate tactician, always cool and calculating. It was said that he prepared for each combat engagement as one would a chess match, analyzing all the potential elements before choosing his move. Upon hearing of Manfred von Richthofen's death in April, he offered the opinion that he'd wished the bastard had burned all the way down. Yet when friends and squadron mates of Mannock had fallen, Mick had wept openly, his tears only increasing his hatred of the enemy. As a leader of men, Mannock was extremely generous with both his knowledge and patience. On more than one occasion, he crippled a German machine and then allowed one of his novice pilots to finish the act of destroying it. Mannock reasoned that this would give the young pilot both experience and confidence, traits that might help keep the new flyer alive longer. Although his official victory tally would be recorded as 73 enemy machines destroyed, no one really knows how many planes he was actually responsible for downing. Mannock died the most dreaded airman's death, in flames. On July 26th, he led one of his novice pilots, Second Lieutenant D.C. Inglis, on patrol over the lines. On the return trip, while passing over the front line positions, a German bullet found Mannock's fuel tank and his machine burst into flames and plowed into the ground. Mick Mannock's body was never recovered, and it wasn't until a year later, long after the war had ended, that he was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross for his service. Edward Mannock's death now left Billy Bishop as the undisputed king of the British Empire's skyfighters. June of 1918 had been the Canadians' final month of combat flying, but what a remarkable month it had been. On the 1st, Bishop had driven down a Falck single-seater near Armentières, and then returned to the same location the following day to destroy another Falck's. On June 4th, he added 2 Albatrosses to his score, knocking them out of the sky just minutes apart. Between the 15th and the 18th, 8 more German aircraft fell victim to a seemingly unquenchable thirst for victories. Bishop's combat formula had been a combination of cool planning, tested and tried tactics, and occasional spurts of recklessness. Like the great ace Albert Ball, he often flew alone and would stalk his intended targets for miles, carefully maneuvering into position until he had the advantage of height or surprise. Other times he would simply fling himself against his opponents, counting on his superior flying and gunnery skills to ensure a successful conclusion to the contest. In June of 1917, Billy Bishop had executed a daring pre-dawn attack on the German airfield at Estermel. Arriving over the field at 4:30 in the morning, he found 7 Albatross fighters sitting on the ground with their engines already running as the Germans prepared for their early morning patrol. As Bishop's Nieuport sped across the field spewing machine gun fire, German pilots raced to their machines and gunned their motors in an attempt to get themselves airborne. With ground fire converging on his craft from all corners of the field, Bishop bore down on the lead German scout, which had just barely left the ground when the Canadian hit it with a short burst and sent it slamming back to earth. A second Albatross also managed to get its wheels off the ground, but as Bishop raced towards it firing, the German swerved into a tree, losing his wings and sending the wreckage cascading to the ground beyond the perimeter of the airfield. Meanwhile, 2 enemy fighters had managed to get into the sky by taking off in the opposite direction. After the second Albatross had crashed into the tree, Bishop had hauled back on the stick and started climbing. Now there were 2 Albatrosses in the air and another pair down below racing to take off. Well, one of the German machines flew a short distance away from the fight to begin maneuvering for advantage, the second albatross made straight for Bishop's Newport, and after a brief dogfight also fell to the Canadians' guns. Seeing that the time was right to flee, Bishop gunned his motor back towards the lines, and by 5:15 was safely back on the ground with No. 60 Squadron at Files Camp Farm. The Newport he'd been flying was shot so full of holes it was a wonder it had remained airborne long enough to bring its pilot home. Later that day, a reconnaissance flight confirmed the Canadians' deeds, and he was soon summoned before the King of England and awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions. A year later, on what would be his last day of combat flying, Bishop would put on another show no less spectacular. On June 19, 1918, Bishop took off alone in the misty drizzle of a gray dawn and started out towards Passchendaele, one of his favorite hunting grounds. Atrocious weather had left the ace with little hope of actually finding Germans on this morning, but over Plogstadt Wood, despite the poor visibility, he suddenly made out the outline of another machine with black crosses on its wings. Bishop had stumbled upon an LVG reconnaissance machine, escorted by 4 Pfalz fighters. In less than 15 minutes, all 5 of the German aircraft were blasted from the sky, and William Avery Bishop flew home and into history as the highest-ranked British surviving ace, with an official score of 72 victories. The High Command deemed that Bishop, with his vast experience, was too valuable to risk in combat, and after being promoted to the rank of lieutenant colonel, was earmarked to be the first commanding officer of the newly formed Canadian Air Force. Although his new administrative job wouldn't have been his first choice, Bishop would spend the last months of the war enjoying the upper social circles that his status had suddenly thrust him into. The pilots of the fledgling U.S. Air Service had established themselves as a first-rate fighting force during their first 6 months at the front. In July, the various pursuit squadrons had traded in their flimsy Newports in favor of the rugged Spad-13s and had immediately begun piling up kills against their German counterparts. An inner ear infection had kept Eddie Rickenbacker out of combat for 6 weeks, but towards the end of July, he'd returned to the 94th Aero, and by late September, he was both America's top-scoring pilot and the Hat-in-the-Ring Squadron's commanding officer. Promoted to captain, Rickenbacker proved to be a great leader and was less concerned with personal glory than he was with the overall success of the squadron. A friendly rivalry had developed between the American units at the front, and it was the 94th Aero that would ultimately claim and hold the lead position. The 94th's closest competitor was the 27th Aero Squadron, also part of the U.S. 1st Pursuit Group. The 27th Aero was commanded by Major Harold Hartney, a flyer of considerable experience, having served in the Royal Flying Corps since early 1915. A capable officer and nurturing leader, Hartney kept his pilots flying hard against their German foes while, like Rickenbacker, emphasizing training and teamwork. In late July, the 27th received a replacement pilot named Frank Luke. A native of Phoenix, Arizona, Luke had grown up one of 9 children raised by his mother and had spent his youth playing football, baseball, and competing on his school's track team. During the summers, he'd found work at the nearby copper mines, and from an early age had become proficient with both pistol and rifle. Aggressive and somewhat of a braggart, Frank Luke had also grown up handy with his fists. From the time of his arrival at the 27th Aero, Luke had managed to make himself unpopular with his fellow flyers. Standoffish yet boastful, the Arizonan made no attempts to hide his contempt for authority and generally found himself somewhat of an outcast. In the air, Luke had a habit of abandoning his assigned flight to go off hunting on his own. On August 16th, he'd done just that, and when he later returned to his airfield claiming to have destroyed a German machine, he was accused of lying by his squadron mates. The business of aerial combat had long evolved beyond the days of individualism. Squadrons were now flying in formations and with organized tactics, and for Luke to abandon his assigned flight meant 2 less guns participating in the total strength of the group. By mid-September, the American Expeditionary Force was preparing for its massive offensive in the Meuse-Argonne region. The last major German thrust of the war had been in June with the Battle of Belleau Wood, and it had been the mostly untried American troops that had held the line and stopped the Kaiser's forces. Now it was the Americans' turn to attack, and the coming offensive would eventually break the German army's back and finally bring the Great War to its conclusion. In the air, September became the busiest month the war had seen. In preparation for the coming offensive, Allied squadrons were virtually kept flying around the clock, and the German Jasta pilots found themselves in a situation reminiscent of April 1917, with vast numbers of enemy airplanes crossing over the German lines. Enemy observation balloons were something that the American fighter pilots were increasingly tasked with attacking. With nearly 1 million U.S. troops moving into position for the coming offensive, it was deemed critical that the German generals be denied the intelligence offered by airborne observers, and the destruction of the balloons was placed on high priority. Frank Luke destroyed a balloon on September 12th. Still seething over the unconfirmed victory claim he'd put in for nearly a month earlier, Luke landed his Spad near an American observation company on the front lines to obtain first-hand confirmation for his kill. Attacking balloons was a dangerous business, and Luke's Spad was shot so full of holes that it was deemed unflyable and earmarked for salvage. In Luke's hands, 5 such planes would be brought home, never to be flown again. Luke had also made a friend in the 27th Aero Squadron. Like the Arizonan, Joseph Werner from Boston, Massachusetts, was also somewhat of a loner, and the two of them quickly became close friends and flying partners. On September 14th, Luke incinerated a pair of German balloons, while Werner stayed above and fought off the Fokkers assigned to protect the gas bags. The next day, using the same tactics, Luke flamed yet another 3 balloons while Werner provided cover. On the evening of the 16th, 3 more German balloons met their fate under Frank Luke's guns. 2 days later, Luke scored his most spectacular success yet when he shot down 2 more balloons and 3 enemy aircraft in the space of only 10 minutes' time. Upon arriving at his field, Luke's elation turned to sorrow when he learned that his partner had been killed. Werner, while providing protection for the Arizona balloon buster, had fallen behind the lines after being shot down by a Fokker. Despondent over the death of his friend, Luke had been urged to take leave in Paris, but had returned to his squadron early, determined to avenge Werner's demise. On September 26th, he set out to attack another balloon, this time with Lieutenant Ivan Roberts providing his upper cover. Luke got his balloon, but Roberts, like Werner, was killed in action. The following morning, Frank Luke set out for an unauthorized flight that added yet another observation balloon to his rapidly growing score. In the minds of his superiors, Luke was out of control, and upon landing was informed that he was to be grounded until further notice. Angry and defiant, Luke took off later in the day and headed out towards enemy territory. The squadron's commanding officer decreed that Luke should be placed under arrest as soon as he returned to the field. This order was never to be carried out. Just before sunset, Luke buzzed the American Forward Observation Headquarters and dropped a note that they should keep an eye on 3 German balloons hanging over the Meuse, immediately across the lines. Sure enough, as the American observers looked on, they saw 3 balloons ignite, one after another, a few minutes later. Frank Luke had held true to his words. Back at the 27th Aero Pursuit Squadron, military police stood ready to arrest the flyer, but he never returned. While attacking the second balloon, Luke had been hit in the chest, and although severely wounded, had managed to destroy the 3rd German balloon before his injury forced him to land on the outskirts of the village of Morveau. The German soldiers occupying the village were in less than good spirits, for as Luke had passed over on his way down, he had strafed the troops in the street. As they raced to the edge of the village where the American Spad had landed, they were met with pistol fire. Luke apparently had no intention of surrendering, and after a brief exchange was killed by the angry German soldiers. Although his wartime career had been remarkably brief, Frank Luke had been credited with destroying 21 enemy balloons and airplanes, placing him number 2 on the list of American scorers. Under General John Blackjack Pershing's command, the American First Army launched its offensive on September 26th. While the French army held the flanks, the U.S. assault began with a rolling artillery barrage that allowed the American troops to smash through the Germans' first line of trenches and battlements. The German army, under the command of General Erich Ludendorff, rushed 6 divisions to the line in an attempt to shore up the defensive positions. For the moment, the American advance was halted at the Argonne Forest, but with the German forces now stretched thin along the front, the British began their own push to the north and quickly recaptured Passchendaele. For Ludendorff, the situation was deteriorating at an alarming rate. Holes had begun appearing up and down the front, and the German general found himself with less and less troops available to plug the breaches in the lines. By early October, 3 British armies had punched their way through the famed Hindenburg Line, the last German line of defense. Further south, General Pershing had been unsuccessful in driving through the Argonne, but the Germans, in placing their priority on defending this region, had left their positions critically weak elsewhere. After nearly 5 years of stalemate, the German lines were crumbling at an astonishing speed, and by mid-October, Ludendorff would report to the Kaiser that the war was lost and the time was at hand to begin negotiations that would bring an end to the fighting. On October 5th, Roland Garros, the world's first true fighter pilot and the war's first flying ace, was shot down and killed over the German lines. It had been a long road from the early pioneering days of aviation to a German prisoner of war camp and finally back to wartime flying. After a period of retraining, the 30-year-old Garros was delighted to find himself back in action with Escadrille Spad No. 26. When he failed to return from a patrol, his squadron mates wondered if he might have suffered the misfortune of being captured by the enemy for a second time. 2 weeks later, an account was published in the German papers stating that Roland Garros, the famous aviator, had been brought down and mortally wounded during a fight with German flyers. As the war drew towards its conclusion, designs continued to roll off the engineers' tables and out of the workshops. These new machines represented a level of sophistication that could not have been imagined in the early days of the war. Faster, stronger, and designed to perform highly specific tasks, the new generation of military aircraft bore little in common with the flying bird cages that had first gone to war in 1914. Anthony Fokker's plant, after the phenomenal success of the D-7, unveiled the Fokker D-8, a compact rotary-engine fighter that he was pinning high hopes on. Like his most famous creation, the Eindecker, the new machine was also a monoplane, sporting a high-wing parasol design and a sleek low-profile silhouette that earned the aircraft the nickname of the Flying Razor. The plane would probably have accounted for itself quite well in combat, but arrived at the front in such small numbers before the armistice halted its production that it never really had a chance to prove its worth. Likewise, the Siemens-Schuckert firm had demonstrated their D-4 fighter in the previous spring and begun producing small numbers of the aircraft for evaluation with selected frontline Jastas. The airplane, a development of the firm's D-3 Scout, utilized a powerful 11-cylinder geared rotary engine that gave the machine a phenomenal rate of climb, but was nearly unflyable owing to the tremendous amount of torque produced on the craft. To counter this problem, the D-4 was fitted with a larger rudder, and its port wings were extended 4 additional inches. Like the newest Fokker monoplane, the Siemens-Schuckert arrived too little and too late at the front to make an impact, but would have undoubtedly proven itself one of the most important designs of the war had the conflict continued. Back in England, the Sopwith Company introduced their final wartime designs. The famous Camel, whose lineage could be traced back to the company's pre-war racing design, was to undergo one more step in its evolution when it was coupled with the new 230 horsepower Bentley rotary engine, fitted with extra struts between its wings, and designated the Sopwith Snipe. Fast climbing, maneuverable and sturdy, the machine outperformed its predecessor, the Camel, and was considerably easier to fly. Before the close of hostilities, 3 Royal Air Force squadrons were to operate exclusively with this new machine, and nearly 500 examples would be built by the end of 1918. The design proved so excellent that it was to become the RAF's standard post-war fighter and would remain in active service all the way through 1927. A heavily armored variant of the airplane, called the Sopwith Salamander, was also introduced to be used as a ground attack machine. It was in a Sopwith Snipe that the last famous dogfight of the war was fought. William George Barker of Dauphin, Manitoba, had talked his way out of an assignment at a training school to be posted to No. 201 Squadron, a frontline unit that had recently traded in their Sopwith Camels for the newer Snipe. Barker had spent the previous year flying Camels on the Italian front, where he had proved himself to be the top British scorer in the theater. During the short time he'd spent with 201 Squadron in France, he had excelled with the newer Sopwith and run his score up to 45 victories. On October 27th, he was to fly back to England and begin his new assignment commanding a training school. It was a remarkably clear day, and as the Canadian ace climbed his Snipe to 22,000 feet, he could see both England, spread out on the far side of the Channel, and equally far into the German side of the lines. Barker had been reluctant to be pulled from combat flying and decided that one more trip over the lines would be a fitting end to his wartime career. Over Bois de Marmel, William Barker came upon a German two-seater, which he maneuvered on and poured a burst into that caused the enemy machine to break apart and fall in pieces towards the ground far below. While Barker had been engaged with the two-seater, a Fokker triplane had appeared and managed a shot that hit Barker in the leg and shattered his right thigh. Flying with one leg, the Canadian outmaneuvered the triplane and sent him down in flames. As Barker turned back towards his own lines, he suddenly found himself in the middle of a formation of a dozen or more Fokker D-7s, hot to avenge the comrades they'd just lost. Now Barker was fighting for his life as Fokkers whirled around him, pouring bullets into his Sopwith fighter. His left leg was quickly smashed by a round, and as Barker fought on, he found himself becoming dizzy from the loss of blood. He'd somehow managed to shoot down two of the attacking Fokkers and had the satisfaction of seeing them fall spinning before he himself lost consciousness and dropped earthwards in a spin of his own. The rush of air revived Barker as he fell, and after righting his plane he realized that the Fokkers had pursued him down and were now pressing their attacks. As the Snipe continued to absorb its punishment, Barker managed to destroy his fifth German machine of the day before an incendiary bullet slammed into his left elbow, rendering that arm completely useless. Seeing an opening, Barker let his Sopwith drop like a stone through the German formation, and this time they did not follow him. His machine riddled like a sieve, the wounded Canadian remained awake just long enough to pilot up near the front lines in an area occupied by a Scottish regiment. As the Scots pulled Barker's body from the mangled remains of the Snipe, they were amazed to discover that the pilot was still alive. And although he would lay in a coma for 2 weeks, he would eventually awaken to learn that the war had ended and he'd been awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions on that day. During the evening of November 10th, Eddie Rickenbacker, America's top ace and the victor of 26 combats, was briefing his assembled pilots on the following day's mission when the telephone rang and a hysterical voice shouted in his ear that the war would end at 11 o'clock the following morning. All patrols were to be canceled, and within minutes, the exuberant pilots of Uncle Sam's Hat in the Ring Squadron had bottles out and a huge bonfire roaring in front of the hangars as the last party of the war began. As morning broke enshrouded in fog, orders came down from above that all machines should stay grounded, but at 10 a.m., Rickenbacker strolled out to the hangars and told his mechanics to prepare his Spad for one more flight. 45 minutes later, he was over no man's land, and then, finally, over the German positions. Not another plane was in the air, and Rickenbacker found it eerie until he saw a brief spurt of flame from down below that signaled someone was shooting at him. He would later find a single bullet hole in his Spad from these last few minutes of the war. Rickenbacker glanced at his watch and then counted down the last minute until 11 a.m. arrived. On cue, men began to spill from the trenches and into no man's land. Slowly, cautiously at first, the soldiers of both sides approached each other. And then it happened. Weapons were flung aside and helmets tossed into the air with a roar as one-time enemies came together and were suddenly hugging and slapping one another on the backs. Flying further north towards the French sector, Rickenbacker found the scene even more incredible. After the most bitter 4.5 years imaginable to mankind, enemy soldiers were kissing each other on both cheeks. Eddie Rickenbacker turned his Spad back towards his home field. The war was over. After more than 4 years of stalemate, the end of the Great War had come with a remarkable suddenness. One minute, millions of men had been desperately engaged in trying to kill one another, and then in the next they had simply laid down their weapons and stopped the bloodshed. When the fighting finally ended and the casualties tabulated, the numbers were staggering. In the course of the war, 10 million men in uniform had lost their lives, killed in battle or died due to injuries or disease. In addition, 21 million more soldiers had been wounded or maimed during the Great War. In essence, an entire generation of European men had simply been removed from the face of the planet. Flying at the front had been a dangerous business during the war. Nearly 30,000 flyers had been counted as the casualties on both sides. History records Manfred von Richthofen with 80 victories as being the greatest ace of World War I. The second-ranked ace of the war was the Frenchman René Fonck, officially credited with destroying 75 German airplanes. The boastful ace had come through the conflict without so much as a scratch, and in the years following the war would remain active in aviation. Before his death in 1953, he would pen his autobiography, titled Ace of Aces, in which he personally claimed 125 victories. France, the nation that had given birth to the very first ace, had recognized 158 of its pilots as having shot down 5 or more enemy aircraft. Third on the list, after René Fonck and George Guynemer, was Charles Nungesser, called the indestructible ace after surviving 17 woundings in combat. Despite injuries that often called for the flyer needing to be lifted into and out of his cockpit, Nungesser survived the war with an impressive 45 kills and continued to fly until 1927, when he disappeared attempting to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. Jean-Michel Nevers, the French ace who distinguished himself over the Battle of Verdun before spending the next 2 years in a mental hospital, was killed shortly after the war's end while practicing to fly under the Arc de Triomphe as part of an armistice celebration. The British had produced a total of 784 aces during the Great War. Billy Bishop, the Empire's top surviving scorer, with 72 victories, continued flying after the war and went on to start one of Canada's earliest commercial aviation companies in partnership with fellow countryman Raymond Barker. After surviving his dramatic fight against dozens of German machines in the closing weeks of the war, Barker, with 53 victories, had continued flying until a crash in 1930 claimed his life. Billy Bishop went on to serve again in the Second World War as an air marshal and would die peacefully in his sleep at home in Canada in 1956. Third on the list of British aces was Black Flight's Raymond Collishaw, who ended the war with 60 German machines downed. At the close of hostilities, Collishaw had remained in the Royal Air Force and, like fellow Canadian Billy Bishop, went on to serve in World War II. Further down the list was Andrew McKeever, the great Bristol two-seater ace who'd emerged victoriously 30 times in combat, only to die in an automobile accident barely a year after the end of hostilities. 363 German flyers qualified as aces, and it was the charismatic Ernst Udet who earned the distinction of being the fatherland's highest surviving scorer. Udet, with 20 victories at the time, had joined Manfred von Richthofen's Jagdgeschwader 1 a scant month before the famous Baron had been killed. Udet had gone on to blast 42 more Allied planes from the air. When von Richthofen's successor, William Reinhardt, was killed, command of the wing was briefly passed to Udet while a new permanent leader was selected. The last wartime commander of Jagdgeschwader 1 and Udet's new boss was a 25-year-old Bavarian flyer named Hermann Goering. Goering would end the war with 22 confirmed victories and would, of course, later rise to the second highest position in the Nazi regime. Udet would distinguish himself between the wars as an aircraft builder, exhibition flyer, explorer, and photographer. When the Nazis came to power, he would go to work for Goering again, this time as a general involved in the technical development of fighter aircraft. In late 1941, when Goering began to use Udet as a scapegoat for failings within the Luftwaffe production system, the famed ace scrawled a note accusing his Reichsmarschall of betrayal and committed suicide by shooting himself in the head. For his part in the atrocities of the Nazi war machine, Goering would go on to cheat justice by himself committing suicide while awaiting judgment in a cell at the Nuremberg prison. Lothar von Richthofen, whom his brother had once dubbed the Butcher, ended the Great War with a final score of 40 enemy airplanes destroyed, exactly half the total victories his more famous brother had been credited with. Because of the periods he'd spent convalescing from wounds, Lothar had accomplished his impressive victory tally with only 77 days of frontline service. The younger von Richthofen's military career had come to an end in August of 1918, on the occasion of his third serious wounding in battle. After the war, he continued flying until his death in a crash near Berlin in 1922. In 1925, the Red Baron's remains were brought home from France for a state funeral at Berlin's Invalidenz Cemetery. The Baron's aging mother was to become the chief caretaker of her son's memory. After the war, much of the family home in Breslau continued to house a museum featuring the Baron's collection of wartime trophies and memorabilia. In 1945, as the Soviet forces swept through Silesia on their way into the heart of the Reich, the Richthofen collection was crated up and shipped back to Moscow, where, presumably, it remains in storage to this day. Souvenirs collected from Manfred von Richthofen's Fokker triplane and his last flight were to make their way into dozens of private collections around the world. Shortly after the armistice, Anthony Fokker was to return home to Holland, where he once again set up an aircraft factory. The success of his D-7 fighter had been so great that the treaty at Versailles had specifically called for all examples of the plane to be turned over to the Allied forces, but Fokker had managed to smuggle a number of the machines back to Holland, where they became the basis of his new company. The post-war years would be good to the Flying Dutchman, with his tri-motored airliners becoming a mainstay of commercial aviation in the 1920s and 30s. America produced 118 aces of her own. Eddie Rickenbacker ended the war as America's ace of aces, 26 German machines having fallen before his guns. Almost immediately following the close of hostilities, Rickenbacker found himself caught up in a wave of public adoration, further sparked by the 1919 awarding of a Congressional Medal of Honor and the publication of his first book, Fighting the Flying Circus. Not content to rest on his laurels, Rickenbacker was to embark on a series of business ventures that included a line of luxury automobiles bearing his famous name and eventually becoming chairman of the board of Eastern Airlines, a company he built virtually from the ground up. During the Second World War, Rickenbacker was again to serve his country, performing important diplomatic work as an envoy to the Soviet Union. Eddie Rickenbacker died peacefully in a hospital bed in Zurich, Switzerland in 1973. James Norman Hall, the American journalist who had been swept into the great adventure and found himself serving, first with the Lafayette Escadrille and then finally with the Hat in the Ring Squadron, ended the war in a German prison camp. In the years that followed, Hall would go on to live on the South Pacific island of Tahiti, where he would author a great many books, including the famous Mutiny on the Bounty